The room was quiet except for the faint beeping of machines. The old man's breath rattled in his chest as he turned to the nurse leaning in to adjust his IV. With a trembling hand, he beckoned her closer, his lips dry but forming words he'd held in for decades. "I did it," he wheezed. "I poisoned my best friend. So many years ago." His words hung in the air like a curse, the nurse frozen as he gasped, "I need someone to know the truth before I die." The rain hammered against the hospital window as Thomas Archer lay still, his breaths shallow and uneven. Every drop sounded like a reminder of time slipping through his fingers. 50 years had passed since the night that shattered everything, and yet the memories remained vivid, sharper now as the end drew near. Edward Grant had been his best friend, a bond forged in childhood and tested through time. They had shared everything, adventures, secrets, and dreams. But some dreams, Thomas knew, turned sour. Jealousy and ambition were poisons, and he had let them destroy the only person who had ever truly believed in him. The room felt colder as Thomas's mind wandered to the past. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flood in. It was a woman, Eleanor. She was Edward's fiancée, radiant and kind, with a smile that could light up a room. Thomas had loved her from the moment he saw her, but she belonged to Edward. For years he buried his feelings, but the night of the engagement party, they erupted. The party was grand, held at Edward's family estate. Chandeliers sparkled, laughter filled the rooms, and the scent of wine and roses lingered in the air. Thomas had stayed by the bar, nursing his jealousy and resentment as Edward moved through the crowd, Eleanor by his side. As the night waned and guests left, Thomas lingered. His plan was simple, born of desperation and bitterness. The vial in his pocket seemed impossibly small, but its contents were deadly. "Tom, you've been quiet," Edward said, approaching him with a warm smile. Edward's voice had always been steady, confident, a leader, a man everyone admired. "What's on your mind?" Thomas forced a smile. "Just overwhelmed. You and Eleanor, you're perfect together." Edward clapped him on the back. "I couldn't have done this without you. You're like a brother to me." The words cut deeper than any insult. Thomas nodded, reaching for the brandy. His hand was steady as he poured, slipping the poison in without hesitation. The liquid swirled, innocent and damning. They drank together, talked about old times. For a moment, Thomas almost convinced himself it wasn't happening. But when Edward began to falter, his words slurring and his hand trembling, reality hit like a hammer. Thomas called for help, his voice frantic. The doctors worked quickly, but it was too late. They called it a heart attack, a tragedy. The town mourned. Eleanor disappeared into her grief, leaving Thomas alone with his guilt. Now, 50 years later, the storm outside echoed the storm inside. Thomas turned his head toward the window, rain streaking the glass like tears. He reached for the phone, dialing the number of a journalist he'd read about, someone who exposed old secrets and sought the truth. When the voice on the other end answered, Thomas's chest tightened. "I need to confess," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about a murder, from 50 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening, but Thomas felt lighter, as if speaking the words had released a fraction of the burden. He had no illusions of redemption, but the truth deserved to see the light of day, even if it condemned him. The phone call lingered in Caleb Ward's mind, a whisper of something darker beneath the surface. The voice on the other end, raspy and desperate, had said, "I killed my best friend." Caleb, a seasoned journalist, had heard many confessions in his career, but something about this one clung to him like a shadow. The next morning, Caleb arrived at the hospital. Thomas Archer's room was small, a sterile corner space with a window overlooking the city. The rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving the streets wet and glistening under a weak morning sun. The old man turned his head as Caleb entered, his eyes sharp despite his frailty. "You're the journalist?" Thomas asked, his voice a fragile whisper. Caleb nodded, pulling out his recorder and notebook. "You said you needed to confess. Let's start with your name and what happened." Thomas coughed, the effort rattling his bony frame. "Edward Grant," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "He was my best friend, more like a brother. We grew up together, did everything together. But then Eleanor came along." "Eleanor?" Caleb prompted, leaning forward. "His fiancée," Thomas said, his tone bitter yet mournful. "She was beautiful, kind, perfect, and I loved her." He paused, his eyes clouded with old pain. "I loved her more than I should have, but she was his. That night, at their engagement party, it all fell apart." "What happened?" Caleb pressed, his pen poised. "I was drunk, angry, jealous," Thomas admitted, his voice trembling. "I'd brought poison, something meant for rats. I told myself Edward didn't deserve her, that if he were gone, maybe I'd have a chance. I poured it into his drink when no one was looking. We talked, laughed like always, but then he started to falter. It was quick. He thought it was a heart attack. Everyone did." Silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint hum of hospital machines. Caleb's mind raced as he jotted down notes. The confession was chilling, but it also felt incomplete. "And Eleanor?" "She disappeared a few months later," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "She knew something wasn't right. She never looked at me the same after that night. I think she suspected, but she never said anything." "You've lived with this for 50 years?" Caleb asked. Thomas nodded, his hands clutching the edge of his blanket. "Every day. It's eaten me alive. But I'm dying now, and I can't take this with me. Edward deserves the truth. Eleanor deserves the truth, even if it means I go to hell for it." Caleb studied the man before him, frail yet resolute. He'd heard many stories in his time, but this felt different. Raw, unpolished, real. "I'll look into it," he said, standing. "But I need honesty from you. No half-truths, no lies. All of it." Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "You'll have it," he said, his voice firm despite his weak body. As Caleb left the room, the weight of the confession settled heavily over him. The rain had stopped, but the air outside still felt oppressive, heavy with unanswered questions. Somewhere out there, the truth of a decades-old betrayal lay buried, and Caleb was determined to uncover it. Caleb's investigation began the moment he stepped out of the hospital. The confession was haunting, but he needed proof. If Thomas's story was true, Edward Grant's death was not the accident it had been believed to be for half a century. The hospital records confirmed part of the tale. Edward Grant had died at 28, the official cause listed as cardiac arrest. There were no signs of foul play in the autopsy. It was a clean, unquestioned case. Almost too clean, Caleb thought. At the town library, Caleb sifted through old newspapers. The engagement party had been a grand event, heavily covered by the society pages. Pictures of Edward and Eleanor were splashed across headlines, their smiles radiant. Hours later, Edward was dead. A brief paragraph in the next week's edition noted his sudden passing, but there was no follow-up, no lingering curiosity. The town, it seemed, had moved on. It was Eleanor who piqued Caleb's curiosity most. Thomas's confession hinted that she had suspected the truth. If she had left town shortly after Edward's death, there had to be a story there. Tracking her down proved challenging, but Caleb eventually uncovered a trail. 10 years after Edward's death, she had remarried, becoming Eleanor Finch in Chicago. The discovery felt monumental. Caleb followed the lead, tracing Eleanor to a quiet suburb outside the city. Her current address, tucked in the midst of old property records, was more than just a clue. It was an opportunity. The idea of confronting her was daunting, but she might hold the answers to the questions that Thomas's confession had raised. Meanwhile, Thomas's health continued to decline. When Caleb returned to the hospital, recorder in hand, The old man's eyes fluttered open. "Did you find anything?" he croaked. Caleb nodded. "Eleanor is alive. She moved to Chicago and remarried." Thomas's face crumpled. "She's alive," he whispered, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I thought she might have died, too." "She moved on," Caleb said carefully, watching for a reaction. "She built a new life." Thomas closed his eyes. She deserved better. Better than the man who killed her future. "Do you think she knew?" Caleb asked. Thomas hesitated. "I think so," he said finally. "She never said it, but her eyes. The way she looked at me after Edward died. It was as if she could see through me. But she never accused me. She just left." "What do you want me to tell her, Thomas?" The old man opened his eyes, the weight of decades etched into his face. "Tell her the truth. Tell her I'm sorry. And tell her that I loved her, even though I had no right to." As Caleb left the hospital, a sense of purpose took hold. Eleanor was the key to understanding the full truth. Her life, changed forever by the events of that night, might hold the answers to the questions that Thomas's guilt had raised. But as Caleb drove toward his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that her side of the story might complicate everything. Somewhere in her memory was the missing piece, and Caleb was determined to find it. Caleb stood outside the modest suburban house, his breath fogging in the crisp Chicago air. The address matched the one in the records, Eleanor Finch's residence. Decades had passed since the events that changed her life, but Caleb hoped time had dulled the wounds enough for her to speak. He rang the doorbell, heart pounding. The door opened, revealing a woman in her 70s, her silver hair neatly pulled back. Her eyes, however, carried the weight of storms weathered long ago. "Yes?" she asked, wary. "Mrs. Finch," Caleb said. "I'm a journalist. I'm working on a story about Edward Grant." At the name, her hand tightened on the door. "What about him?" "It's about the circumstances of his death," Caleb said gently. "I spoke to someone who has carried a burden for decades and wanted to confess." "Who?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper now. "Thomas Archer," Caleb said. "He claims—" "That he killed Edward," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold. Caleb blinked, stunned. She folded her arms. "I've known for years." "You knew?" he asked softly. "I didn't know at first," she admitted, her tone softening. "But I suspected. Thomas couldn't hide guilt. After Edward died, he tried to comfort me, but he couldn't even meet my eyes." She glanced at the quiet street. "I didn't have proof, but my heart knew. That's why I left." "Why didn't you confront him?" Caleb asked. Eleanor's expression hardened. What good would it have done? Edward was gone. Confronting him wouldn't bring him back. Her voice trembled as she added, "Maybe I didn't want to hear him admit it. I couldn't bear it." Caleb hesitated. "Thomas asked me to tell you he's sorry. He wanted you to know he loved you, even though—" "Even though he destroyed everything?" Eleanor interrupted, shaking her head. "I don't need his apologies. They won't change what happened." She looked away, her voice breaking. "I loved Edward. I trusted Thomas. I never thought he could—" Silence stretched between them. Caleb pressed gently. "Thomas wants the truth to come out. Do you think it should?" Eleanor's gaze turned distant. "The world doesn't care about Edward. He's a name in an old newspaper. But if Thomas thinks confessing will give him peace, let him. It won't change anything for me." Caleb nodded. "Thank you for speaking with me. If you ever want to share more—" "I've said all I need to," she said firmly. "This is your story now." As Caleb walked back to his car, her words lingered. Eleanor had carried her grief and suspicions for decades, but the pain was still etched in her voice. She might have accepted the past, but it had never truly left her. Driving away, Caleb replayed the conversation in his mind. Thomas's confession had added weight, but Eleanor's confirmation gave it shape. He now had two sides of the story, each filled with pain and regret. It was time to bring these truths to light, but not before verifying every last detail. Edward Grant's name might have faded, but Caleb was determined to ensure his story, and Thomas's guilt, would not. The drive back to the hospital was silent, Caleb's mind racing with Eleanor's words. She had lived with suspicion and grief for decades, but her rejection of Thomas's apology added another layer to the story. Could Thomas handle knowing she didn't forgive him? Thomas was weaker when Caleb returned, his breathing shallow and labored. Yet his gaze turned toward the door as Caleb entered. "Did you find her?" he croaked. "I did," Caleb replied, pulling a chair closer. "She suspected what you did. She said she saw the guilt in your eyes. That's why she left. She couldn't stay." Thomas's eyes closed, his body trembling. "I thought it was just grief. But it was me. I drove her away." "She doesn't want your apology," Caleb added carefully. "She said it wouldn't change anything." Thomas flinched as if struck. "I don't blame her. I took everything from her. Edward, their future, her happiness. An apology means nothing." Caleb hesitated. "Why did you love her?" Thomas's voice wavered. "Because she saw me. Edward was the star. I was just his shadow. But Eleanor, she made me feel like I mattered. When I realized I couldn't have her, I let my jealousy consume me, and I destroyed everything." The room fell silent, the weight of Thomas's guilt suffocating. Caleb finally asked, "Why confess now, after all this time?" Thomas's gaze shifted to the ceiling. "Because it's killing me," he said, his voice trembling. "Every day I see Edward's face. I hear his voice, and every night I see Eleanor walking away. I can't take it with me. Edward deserves the truth, even if it doesn't matter to anyone else." Caleb leaned forward. "Do you think Eleanor will ever forgive you?" Thomas shook his head. "No, and I don't deserve it. But she should know. Edward should be remembered as the man he was." As Caleb prepared to leave, Thomas's frail voice stopped him. "Caleb," he whispered. "Yes." Caleb turned back. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "Something I never told anyone. Eleanor, she wasn't just Edward's fiancée." His eyes filled with pain. She was carrying his child. Caleb froze, the words unraveling everything he thought he understood. "Are you sure?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "She told me the night before the party. She wanted me to be happy for them. But all I felt was jealousy. That's when I decided. I couldn't let him have everything. And now I've destroyed it all." Caleb sat back, his mind racing. The story had taken a darker turn. Eleanor's departure now carried a deeper meaning, and Thomas's guilt was no longer just about betrayal. It was about the destruction of a family. Thomas's voice softened. "I thought, maybe someday I could make it right, but there's no fixing this." Caleb nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. "You've told me a lot, Thomas. I'll make sure the truth comes out." Thomas's eyes flickered, a mixture of gratitude and anguish. "Thank you," he murmured, "for listening, for caring enough to do this." As Caleb left the hospital room, the enormity of the story settled over him like a storm. Thomas's guilt was immense, but the impact of his actions extended far beyond himself. Somewhere, Eleanor carried the weight of a life that had been stolen, and Caleb knew the truth would demand more than just telling. It would demand justice. Caleb's next steps took him deeper into the shadows of the past. Armed with Thomas's confession and Eleanor's revelations, he knew the story wasn't just about guilt. It was about lives unraveled and futures stolen. Revisiting the archives, Caleb focused on Edward's family. The Grants were prominent in their town, their wealth and influence extending far. Edward's death was mourned widely, but questions about his life faded over time. Yet, as Caleb dug deeper, he found Edward was not just a golden boy. He was a man with ambition. He had plans to modernize the family's business and expand it, but those plans had stirred controversy even within his family. To understand more, Caleb tracked down Harold Mayhew, a retired attorney close to Edward's father. Over coffee in a dim diner, Harold spoke about Edward with admiration. "He had vision," Harold said. "His ideas could have changed everything. He wasn't afraid to shake things up. Some admired him for it, others, not so much." "What about Thomas Archer?" Caleb asked. Harold frowned. Thomas was always in Edward's shadow. Edward treated him like family, but I think Thomas resented that. He never quite belonged, and I think it ate at him. "And Eleanor?" Caleb pressed. Harold's face softened. Eleanor was remarkable. Smart, charming, a perfect match for Edward. Her leaving after his death was the town's second tragedy. She was carrying so much grief. Everyone could see it. Leaving the diner, Caleb felt the stakes of the story grow heavier. Edward wasn't just a friend or fiancé. He was pivotal to so many lives. Thomas's jealousy had destroyed more than one person. Back at his office, Caleb turned his attention to Eleanor's pregnancy. If she had carried Edward's child, where was that child now? Research led him to Daniel Finch, born a year after Edward's death and listed as Eleanor's son. His records were sparse, but Caleb traced him to Michigan. The drive to Michigan was long, and Caleb's mind swirled with questions. When he reached Daniel's house, the sun was setting. He knocked, and a man in his 40s opened the door. His features, sharp eyes, a strong jaw, were strikingly familiar. "Yes?" Daniel asked, his tone cautious. "Daniel Finch. I'm Caleb Ward, a journalist working on a story about Edward Grant. I believe he was your father." Daniel stiffened. "You're mistaken. My father was Richard Finch." Caleb held his ground. "I've spoken to your mother. I know about Edward. Please, I just want to talk." After a tense moment, Daniel stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Inside, Caleb explained his investigation. As he spoke, Daniel's guarded expression softened into something more pained. When Caleb mentioned Thomas's confession, Daniel leaned back, pale. "I always wondered why my mother refused to talk about Edward. She said he was someone from her past, but I could see how much it hurt her." "Do you think she knew what Thomas did?" Caleb asked. Daniel nodded. "She must have, but she kept it from me. Maybe to protect me, or maybe to protect herself." Caleb leaned forward. "Daniel, this isn't just about Edward or Thomas. It's about you. Your father's memory deserves to be told." Daniel's face hardened, but his voice trembled. "Then let's tell it," he said quietly. "Let's make sure the truth comes out." Daniel's agreement to uncover the truth brought Caleb closer to completing the story. As Daniel spoke of Eleanor's silence, Caleb saw the pain she had shielded him from for decades. "Do you remember anything she told you about Edward?" Caleb asked. "She called him the kindest man she'd ever met," Daniel said. "She didn't say much, but I could tell she loved him. When I was a teenager, I found a box in the attic with his letters and pictures from their engagement." "Do you still have it?" Caleb asked eagerly. "I think so," Daniel said, heading to a closet. The box was dusty and tightly sealed, as if locked away both physically and emotionally. Inside were photographs of Edward and Eleanor, their joy frozen in time. Letters, aged and delicate, bore Edward's bold handwriting. One letter, dated 2 days before Edward's death, stood out. Edward wrote about reconciling with Thomas. "Tom has been distant. I think he feels left behind, but I'll talk to him. He's my brother in every way that matters, and I want him to know how much he means to me." The words hit Caleb like a punch. Edward had been reaching out even as Thomas planned his betrayal. "This changes everything," Caleb murmured. "How?" Daniel asked. Edward saw Thomas as family, Caleb said. He wanted to fix things. It makes what happened even more tragic. Daniel's jaw tightened. He killed a man who cared about him. That's hard to accept. After carefully packing the letters back, Caleb asked, "Can I use these in the story?" Daniel nodded. If it helps people understand who Edward was, then yes. Caleb spent days piecing together the timeline from the letters. They painted a picture of love interrupted by betrayal, but Caleb needed to confront Thomas one last time. When Caleb returned to the hospital, Thomas was frail, his breaths shallow. His eyes flickered open as Caleb entered. "You're back," he rasped. "I spoke with Daniel," Caleb said. "He knows about Edward now." Thomas's face twisted with relief and sorrow. "And Eleanor?" "She protected him," Caleb replied. "She never told him everything, but he knows now." Caleb handed Edward's letter to Thomas. "Did you know about this?" Thomas's hands trembled as he scanned the words. A tear slipped down his cheek. "He cared about me," he whispered. "Even after everything, he still cared." "That's what makes this so hard to understand," Caleb said softly. "Why didn't you stop yourself?" Thomas closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. "Because I was weak. I let envy blind me. And now I have to live, or die, with it." Caleb leaned forward. "There's still time to set things right. The truth will come out, but it's up to you how it's told." Thomas nodded faintly. "Tell them everything. Let the world know who Edward was, and what I did to him." As Caleb left the hospital, the weight of the story pressed heavily on his shoulders. The final pieces were falling into place, but Caleb knew the hardest part was yet to come, telling the world about love, betrayal, and lives shattered by one man's jealousy. Caleb's story was nearing completion, but the weight of the final steps pressed heavily. Thomas's confession, Eleanor's grief, and Daniel's discovery painted a picture of love and betrayal, but the question lingered. What did the world need to know? Caleb met with his editor, Angela Price. She listened intently as Caleb laid out the story. When he finished, she leaned back, her fingers steepled. "You're implicating a dying man in a decades-old crime. Are you certain about this?" Caleb nodded. "This story isn't just about Thomas. It's about Edward, Eleanor, and everyone affected. It has to be told." Angela considered. "If we run this, there will be backlash. People loved Edward, but they've forgotten. Reopening this could stir old wounds." "Wounds don't heal without truth," Caleb replied. Angela sighed. "All right, but it has to be airtight. The letters, the interviews, the hospital visits, everything." Caleb spent days organizing notes, scanning letters, and crafting the article. Each word was carefully chosen. The narrative focused on Edward's legacy and the devastating consequences of jealousy. When the first draft was complete, Caleb read it aloud, his voice faltering over emotional passages. The story was raw but hopeful, a testament to resilience. With Angela's approval, the article was scheduled for publication. Caleb's nerves frayed as the release date approached. Would the story bring healing, or just more pain? The night before publication, Caleb visited Thomas one last time. The old man's condition had deteriorated, but when Caleb told him the story was set to go live, a faint smile touched his lips. "Thank you," Thomas rasped, "for giving Edward the truth he deserved." Caleb hesitated. "Are you ready for the world to know everything?" Thomas's gaze was steady. "I've carried this for 50 years. Let them judge me. I only hope Edward's memory outshines my sins." The story went live the next morning. Reactions were swift and divided. Many praised the article for uncovering the truth, celebrating Edward's legacy while mourning what was lost. Others criticized reopening the past, seeing Thomas's confession as too little, too late. Eleanor emailed Caleb that afternoon. Thank you for telling Edward's story. For the first time in years, I feel like he's been truly seen." Daniel called, his voice emotional. "People are reaching out to me, asking about my father. It's overwhelming, but I think it's what he would have wanted." By evening, Caleb's inbox overflowed with messages from Edward's old acquaintances and strangers moved by the story. Angela called, her voice full of pride. "This is bigger than we anticipated. You've done something important here." Caleb hung up, exhaustion and relief washing over him. The story had found its place in the world, bridging past and present. As he sat in his quiet apartment, Caleb thought of Edward, Eleanor, Daniel, and even Thomas. The truth had finally come to light, but its echoes would linger long after the headlines faded. The ripple effects of Caleb's article extended farther than he anticipated. Edward's story, buried for decades, was now at the center of public attention. Strangers shared messages of admiration for a man they'd never known, while those who remembered Edward spoke of his kindness and vision. But not all responses were kind. Critics attacked Thomas's confession, accusing him of cowardice for waiting until his deathbed to admit his crime. Some called his apology self-serving, a last attempt for absolution. Online debates divided readers. Some praised Thomas for his courage while others dismissed him as too late. Caleb focused on the story's purpose rather than the backlash, but every critique felt personal. He had worked tirelessly to unearth the truth, only to see it questioned by strangers unaware of the pain behind it. Daniel struggled too. He called Caleb one evening, his voice heavy. "This is harder than I thought. People keep asking me about Edward, about my mom. I don't know what to say." "Be honest," Caleb told him. "Edward's story is yours too, but it's okay to set boundaries." Daniel sighed. I wish I'd known him. All I have now are these letters and the stories people tell me." Caleb's heart ached for Daniel, grappling with a legacy he'd only recently discovered. But he believed Edward's story wasn't just about loss. It was about resilience. Days later, Caleb received a message from Harold Mayhew, the retired attorney he'd interviewed. Harold wanted to meet, saying he had something important to share. Intrigued, Caleb met him at the diner. "I've been thinking about Edward," Harold began, "and about Thomas. There's something I didn't tell you before." Caleb leaned forward. "What is it?" "Edward's death wasn't just a tragedy for his loved ones. It changed everything. The family business fell apart. His father never recovered, and Edward's plans were abandoned. The Grants lost their influence. It was as if the heart of the family had been ripped out." Caleb nodded. "I've seen that in my research. But what does this have to do with Thomas?" Harold hesitated. Thomas didn't just kill his best friend. He destroyed a future that could have benefited many. The words hit Caleb hard. Thomas's crime wasn't just personal. It was generational. His actions left a void that rippled through time, affecting not just Edward's loved ones but an entire community. Back at the hospital, Caleb shared Harold's words with Thomas. The old man was weaker than ever, his breaths shallow, but his eyes remained sharp as he listened. "I knew," Thomas whispered. "I knew what Edward could have done, who he could have been. But in that moment, I didn't care. I only cared about what I couldn't have. And now it's too late." Caleb hesitated. "Do you regret confessing?" Thomas shook his head. "No. The truth needed to come out, not for me, but for Edward. The world deserves to remember him." As Caleb left the hospital, he felt the story drawing to a close. Thomas's confession had been the catalyst, but Edward's legacy was the heart of it. The truth had resurfaced, but Caleb knew the hardest part still lay ahead, helping the world understand the cost of one man's jealousy and another man's silence. Thomas Archer passed away 3 days after Caleb's final visit. The news came quietly, a brief notice from the hospital staff. His death marked the end of a life defined by guilt, but for those left behind, it was only the beginning of reckoning with the truth. Caleb attended the modest funeral, a small gathering of hospital staff and distant acquaintances. There was no family present, no one to mourn the man who had spent most of his life in solitude. Caleb stayed to the side, his thoughts on Edward, Eleanor, and the life Thomas had stolen. As the casket was lowered, Caleb thought about the story he'd told. It had reached far and wide, bringing light to a long-buried tragedy, but it had also raised questions about forgiveness, redemption, and the lasting impact of jealousy. Thomas's confession was not a resolution, it was a catalyst. In the weeks following the funeral, Caleb continued to hear from readers moved by the story. Letters poured in, some sharing similar tales of guilt and redemption, others expressing anger at Thomas's actions. The story had sparked a national conversation about morality and the weight of the truth. Eleanor reached out again, this time inviting Caleb to visit her in Chicago. When he arrived at her home, she greeted him with a warm but weary smile. They spoke for hours, reflecting on the story's aftermath. Eleanor admitted she had read every word of the article multiple times. "It hurt to relive it," she said, her voice steady. "But it also gave me a strange sense of peace. Edward deserved to be remembered, and now he is." "What about Thomas?" Caleb asked carefully. Eleanor paused, her gaze distant. "I'll never forgive him," she said firmly, "but I understand him now, and maybe that's enough." Daniel joined them later, bringing a box of Edward's letters and photographs. Together, they sorted through the remnants of a life cut short, sharing stories and memories. For the first time, Caleb felt the weight of the story lift, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. As he drove back to his apartment, Caleb reflected on the journey. The truth had come at a cost, but it had also brought clarity. Edward's legacy, once overshadowed by Thomas's actions, had found its rightful place in the world. The final chapter of Caleb's article focused not on Thomas's confession, but on Edward's enduring impact. It celebrated his kindness, his vision, and the strength of those who had loved him. Readers responded with an outpouring of admiration, ensuring Edward's name would not fade again. Months later, Caleb visited Edward's grave, a simple marker nestled under a large oak tree. He left a single white rose, a gesture of respect for the man whose story had changed so many lives. As Caleb walked away, he felt a rare sense of fulfillment. The story had come full circle, not tied up neatly but resolved enough to let those involved move forward. Edward was remembered, Thomas was understood, and the world had been given the truth. Sometimes, Caleb thought, that was enough.